Hey guys, welcome back. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about basic endgames, something that should be in every player's repertoire. Of course, typically if you're going to win a game, you're going to have to understand endgames and understand how they work in order to close out your opponents. Um, I'm going to be going over some basic stuff today, nothing too crazy, but I think there's some interesting things for everyone to learn here. So before I get started, you may have noticed some upgrades to the channel. I got a new mic, which I think was long overdue. Hopefully, you guys can hear me better. And of course, now you can see my beautiful face. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, but I guess be happy maybe that it's not in HD. So, if you guys have any recommendations or any things you want me to cover in future videos, please let me know in the comments. And remember to like and subscribe if you guys are enjoying the stuff. All right? So, back to endgames. So the first thing I want to talk about is checkmating. So even if you're up in a game, even if you're ahead in material, in order to actually beat your opponent, you're going to need to know how to checkmate. So what is checkmate exactly? And here we have a position that highlights checkmate very nicely. Checkmate is when your opponent's king or your king is in check. So that's the queen delivering the check here. And the king has nowhere to go. Square is covered by the queen. The square is covered by the queen, and you can't capture the queen because your opponent's king is actually guarding it. Okay, so this is a great example of checkmate. So the next question after this is, what do we actually need minimum to checkmate our opponents? Um, so I think this goes without saying, but if there's the only two pieces on the board are kings remaining in a game, you're not going to be able to checkmate your opponent. So you can make some moves here, but the problem is kings are not allowed to come within one square of each other. So these kings are going to dance around forever, and this game is just simply a draw. So with that in mind, I'm about to rapid fire quiz you guys with some examples here and see if you can figure out or think of whether or not checkmating is possible with the pieces that I'm going to be presenting you guys. So first, we're going to go with king and knight. So if you have a king and a knight and your opponent only has his king left, do you guys think you can checkmate your opponent? Do you think this game's winnable for white here? The answer is no. A king and a knight cannot checkmate. So the opponent's king will always have an escape route if you use these two pieces or this one piece with the king. So here's just an example of you're never going to be able to checkmate the king. And actually, let's say it was black's turn to move here. This would be a stalemate. This square is covered by the knight. This square is covered by the king. This square is also covered by the knight. But notice the king's not in check. So this would end in a stalemate, basically. This is not possible. In fact, if you were to play this on, chess.com or whatever, and you had this amount of material, the game would automatically end in a draw. They wouldn't even let you keep playing this. Okay? So next question. King and bishop. Is this doable for white? The answer, again, is unfortunately no. Cannot check your opponent's king with these two pieces. Again, this would just end in a draw automatically if you're playing online. This is not possible. Okay? Next question. Let's say you have a knight and a bishop. Is this possible to checkmate your opponent? And the answer here is yes, but it's crazy complicated, and you will probably never see this in your entire life playing. Even if you play chess every day, this is very rare. It's basically like getting a royal flush in poker. So, never going to see this. It's very complicated. So, I'm not even going to waste everybody's time going over this today. Okay, next round. You got two bishops and your king. Is this possible? Answer is yes. You can checkmate with two bishops. This is also pretty complicated. It takes a lot of time to go over this and how this works, so I'm going to be covering this in another video at a later time. Next question. King and queen. Can you checkmate your opponent with these two pieces? And the answer, hopefully you guys got this one, is yes. And I will be going over this in a second. The thing you have to watch out for with these with when you have a queen is you don't want to stalemate your opponent. Okay, so we'll get back to that in a bit. And next question, king and rook. Can you checkmate your opponent with this piece and your king? And the answer also is yes. It's a little bit more complicated than with a queen, but it is doable, and I'm going to show you guys how to do that also in a second. And final question, let's say you have a pawn, so you're up one pawn. Can you checkmate your opponent here? Kind of a trick question, because you can promote this pawn to a queen or a rook, and we just went over the fact that you can checkmate if you have, a queen or a rook with your king. So the question here really is, are you allowed to promote this pawn? And that's actually a very difficult question to answer. There's a lot that goes into that. So I'm going to be covering that in another video as well, just solely based on king and pawn endgames, because this is very common. And it's pretty interesting, and it's very important to know as any level chess player. Okay. So a couple things to mention about endgames as well. I did mention stalemates. Very important not to stalemate. So stalemating is when you're not checking your opponent's king, but your opponent has no legal moves to make. In other words, any move he would make would put himself in check, for example. Another important thing is the 50 move rule in chess. So if you're trying to checkmate your opponent's king, if you can't checkmate them in 50 moves and you don't capture any pawns, then that game will automatically end in a draw. Now, this doesn't really come up very often in real life. It might come up when you have like a bishop and knight endgame, because it's so complicated. It takes very specific moves. And if you don't know what you're doing with, let's say, a bishop and knight endgame, then you could end up running into that. But typically, it's not something that is really a problem. So this position in front of us I have here, we're white. We're up, right? We have a queen, and our opponent only has a bishop. Now, the queen should be able to dominate this, right? This should be a fairly easy endgame to win. But I wanted to highlight here how easy it could be to accidentally stalemate in a position where you're winning material. Okay, so let's say we play a pretty natural move here. Queen to h8 check. Okay, looks pretty good. Now let's say our opponent moves his bishop back to b8. Now we can't take this bishop because we'll be hanging our queen, and it'll end in a draw because the black will be able to recapture. So let's say we make another fairly common move here. Queen to c8. We're preparing this. Checkmate. Well, guess what? This is actually a stalemate. So our king is covering these squares, and this bishop can't move. If this bishop moves anywhere, he's putting his own king in check. So this is an example of a stalemated position that's fairly easy to come by. Let's see what else we have here. We have another potential stalemate. Let's say we play king to a6, preparing this move here. Okay? This will end up being a checkmate for us. Our opponent plays bishop to b4, blocking. Let's say we capture. Checkmate again. So we're covering this entire row here, and the king also can't move here because of our king. So these are just two examples of very simple mistakes, basically, that can result in stalemates that you really want to avoid. So what you want to do is really, there's no like specific rules or anything like that for how to avoid this. You just have to think and be patient. Hopefully, you have some time on your clock, let's say, if you're playing a time chess, and you can kind of think through the position and make sure that you're not blundering this, because it's not a great feeling when you're winning a game. Let's say you had a really hard fought game and you're up and you accidentally make one move mistake right at the end and you blow it and it ends in a draw. So something to avoid. Okay, and we're going to go back now and we're going to talk about the basics of checkmating with queens and rooks. So there's a lot of ways to do this. This isn't the only way to do this, but it's a nice, simple way, I think, of thinking about it that should help beginners understand how to checkmate in these positions. So it's our turn to move here, and we have the queen. Okay, so the first move we want to make is d4. Simple, and what we're doing is basically boxing in our opponent's king. So we're creating a box here, and this king is only relegated to these squares here for moves. He can't possibly go run past this queen. You'll notice with the queen, your opponent's king can never approach the queen. So the only way to actually give up or blunder your queen is if you accidentally move her right next to your opponent's king and he grabs her. Otherwise, this king can never get close to the queen. Okay? So now we've created our box. Their opponent moves back to c7. We're going to rotate our king around. So whenever we have a single piece, even oftentimes when we have more than one piece, we have to work together with the king and the piece in order to deliver checkmate. The queen can never checkmate the king alone. So we're going to have to get our king involved, and that's a typical setup in endgames. So our opponent's just repeating moves here. Your opponent will never want to go into the corner. The corner is the worst place to be. You have the least amount of movement with your pieces. Easiest place to checkmate a king is the corner. Oftentimes you have to drive the king there in order to checkmate him. So he's repeating moves. I'm bringing my king into the game now. So I bring my king up here, and notice I've cut off this square here for him to repeat his moves. Okay, he plays here, and I tighten this box with my queen. So now he only has 6 squares to move to. So I'm tightening the noose here, taking it slow, but there is an important thing that you have to notice when you're doing this endgame with the queen. So I'm bringing my king even closer now. So I'm going to check him, and now I'm cutting him off even further. Now he's only got 4 squares to go to, and he's going to go back. Now, if maybe you're a beginning player, you might play b6 here. Even if you're not a beginning player, this happens to everybody. You might decide, oh, but I want to cut off the king even further. I'm going to move my king even closer to him. I'm going to play b6. If you play b6 here, this game will automatically end in a stalemate draw. So we've got the king off from these squares. You'll also notice our queen also, bears down the diagonal here. So she's covering these squares too. There's only 1 square for our opponent's king to move to. If we move up with our king, we're cutting off that final square for the king. And then he's got nowhere to go. But notice he's not in check. So this game would end in a stalemate. Something you have to watch out for always when you're checkmating with queens. Okay? So here I'm going to move my queen to d7. So now I'm allowing him this 1 square here to run off to. But I'm preparing the checkmate on the next couple moves. So he moves to that only square. Of course, he has this square as well, so we can keep repeating these moves. I'm not in danger of stalemating him. So I move even closer, and now I'm preparing for the killing blow. So he moves to b8, his only legal move, and I bring the queen in. And this game ends in checkmate. So I think the main point here is thinking about it as boxing in your opponent's king and worrying for making sure you're avoiding stalemate. Otherwise, it's fairly straightforward with some practice. I think everybody can learn this pretty quick. Okay? And now on to rooks. And rooks are a similar type of strategy. We're trying to box in our opponent's king. However, there's a couple differences. Your opponent's king can approach the rook and can capture the rook if he's not defended by your king. So you always want to make sure you're aware of that when you're doing this. And there's a little bit more strategy and a little bit more, I guess, skill, you could say, that goes into checkmating here. But this is also an important technique. So we've got our rook and we move up to g4. So it's a similar thing here. We're cutting off our king, our opponent's king. We're boxing him in. Okay? And it's slowly shrinking that box. So our opponent plays to e5. And we're going to play rook to f4. Closing the box a little bit. Our opponent moves back. Again, we have to make sure we get the king involved. Always has to be, especially with this endgame with rooks. There's a very specific way this game has to end, and your king has to be right in the thick of this. So, okay. Play here. Our opponent goes to d6. And we're just moving up. We're cutting off more squares from our opponent's king. And notice how our king is defending our rook. Always has to be defending. If our king was elsewhere, this rook could be captured. Drawn game. So now I'm actually swapping sides here. But I'm keeping this box. So our opponent only has 12 squares here. So he's going to move to f6. Again, closing the box. and closing the box even further. So there's an important moment coming up here. Okay. So our opponent's king ran to g8. Now notice, let's say he moves. What we're trying to do here is basically banish him to one single file of the board. So our rook goes, vertically, horizontally. But if we can get our rook onto g1 or anywhere on this file, and we can force our king back, well, that king is now trapped on this file forever. And that's basically how you have to start this checkmate. So you'll notice here, if he goes back, all you have to do is move the rook to the g file. And then, you're setting him up here. But besides moving backwards, which would be a bad move for black, he only has one other move here. And that move is going back to g7. And that's very important because when these kings are facing each other, this is what's known as opposition. And what it means, I kind of touched on it very briefly before. If these kings are facing each other, it means that neither king can progress. So either king that has to move has to go backwards, basically is what it means. So in order to get that scenario here, what we're going to do, we know that he's going to play g7 next move. So we're going to move our rook back. It's basically a waiting move. It's basically forcing our opponent to make a move. Okay? So we go back to f1, and our opponent's going to go to g7, right? And now, when we check the king on the g file, this king has nowhere else to go. He can't go closer to our king, and he can't stay on this file. So now he's going to have to retreat backwards. And actually, that would be a worse move because he's right in the corner. So let's say he goes here instead, right? Now we've got him on the ropes. So we bring our king in, and now he's kind of locked in here. And he's going to go all the way down, running away from our king on this file. Now notice our rook's under attack, so we have to move our rook. So we're going to just transfer him up to the top here. And our opponent plays h1. And we're going to play f2 because, again, this is very similar to what pushing him onto the other rank was. We know he only has one move here. He has to go to h2. Okay? So once he makes this move, these kings are now lined up. That means that these three squares are now taken away from our opponent's king. So only when these two kings are facing each other and our opponent's king is on the back file here, the last file, only then can we deliver the checkmate with the rook. So once this happens, we play h8, and that's checkmate. Very specific, and this is the only way to do it with a rook. So it's an important thing to practice and understand. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up the basics for today. Covered a lot of stuff again, a lot of basic ideas. However, I would not leave you without a puzzle. So we're going to go here. Okay. So we're black. Okay, we have a knight and a king. Our opponent has a king and a pawn. And this is, covers some of the stuff we went over today. It also covers some things we didn't maybe go over completely, but it should be a good test of your guys' knowledge here. So what I want you guys to do is pause the video and figure out if black should win this game, will win this game, if white will win this game, or if this game should end in a draw. Okay? So give yourselves a few seconds, pause the video, and I will go over what happens here in a few seconds. Okay, so let's just get one thing out of the way first. Black cannot win this game. As I mentioned earlier, you cannot win a chess game if you only have a knight. So the best black can hope for here is a draw. You'll notice that white is only one square away from promoting his pawn into a queen. And we know that queens and kings together can deliver checkmates. So it appears that white's up here. But is there a way for black to force a draw at the end of this game here? The answer is yes. So the move we have to make with our knight, you'll notice our king is way out of the game here. He has no influence or impact on basically the ending of this. So what we have to do is play knight to e7. Now the whole point of that is because we're checking our opponent's king, that our opponent has to respond to the check. The opponent cannot promote the pawn here. And what we're doing after the king moves is we're controlling the square in front of the promotion for this pawn with our knight. So now we're going to play knight to c8 check. Okay, so we're controlling the square. We're not allowing the pawn to move forward. Wherever this king moves, the basic idea here is that our knight can constantly dance around the king while always maintaining his grip on this c8 square, not allowing the opponent's pawn to ever promote. So no matter what this king does, we can even go over to a7. And let's say he moves here. Well, we're not going to move back because then the king will capture us, but we still have the square. So we're still okay. We can just play a move with our king. Okay, we can play a couple moves. If he tries to come around to attack our knight again, we're just going to go right back to c8. And we're just going to continue this dance forever, and this game will end in a draw. So this is a common endgame technique with knights. You want to, as long as you can control the square in front of your opponent's pawn, that opponent cannot push his pawn any longer. So, let's say we keep playing this out. Let's say he decides finally to just promote this pawn. We're going to capture. Our opponent's going to capture our knight, and this game will end in a draw. So the important point here in the beginning was making sure we recognize the check, giving us an extra turn of movement here for our knight. Okay? So that pretty much wraps it up for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.